In the rugged hills of the American South, long before the world went up in flames in the 1940s, a boy named Arthur lived by a rule that most modern soldiers could never understand. One bullet, one meal. This was the backwoods, a place where poverty was as thick as the humid summer air, and the grocery store was the forest itself. Arthur didn't grow up with tactical manuals or military instructors. He grew up with a father who handed him a beat-up bolt-action rifle and a single box of cartridges that had to last the entire winter. To Arthur, that rifle wasn't just a tool, it was an extension of his own body. It was a mail-order special, a weapon the city folks would laugh at, bought from a Sears, Roebuck & Co. catalog for a few dollars. It had a worn wooden stock, a barrel that had seen better days, and sights that only he knew how to align. But in the silence of the woods, Arthur learned the language of the wind and the shadows. He learned to breathe with the rhythm of the trees and to pull the trigger only when the heartbeat of the forest matched his own. If he missed a squirrel or a deer, his family went hungry. That was his training ground. When the war broke out and the draft eventually called his name, Arthur didn't look like a hero. He arrived at the induction center as a lean, quiet kid with dirt under his fingernails and a slow, rhythmic way of speaking. When he eventually reached the Pacific Theater, he brought that same quiet intensity with him. But while his fellow soldiers were obsessed with their shiny new M1 Garands and the rapid-fire capabilities of their Thompson submachine guns, Arthur clung to the familiar. He had managed, through a series of stubborn requests and backroom deals, to keep a bolt-action rifle that resembled the one he had used back home, a weapon that looked woefully out of place in a modern war machine. In the staging areas of the Solomon Islands, the mockery started almost immediately. The city boys from New York and Chicago, who had learned to shoot on military ranges with unlimited ammunition, couldn't help themselves. They looked at Arthur's slow, deliberate cleaning of his old-fashioned rifle and laughed. "Hey, Arthur," they'd jeer, "did you get that out of a cereal box? Or planning on hunting rabbits while we fight a war?" They called it his mail-order junk, convinced that in the fast-paced, terrifying chaos of a Japanese ambush, Arthur and his slow-loading relic would be the first to fall. But Arthur just went about his business, his eyes always scanning the tree line. He knew something they didn't. He knew that in the dense, suffocating green of the jungle, speed didn't matter as much as the ability to see what was hidden. He knew that the Japanese snipers, hidden in the canopy like ghosts, wouldn't be defeated by a hail of random bullets, but by a single, perfectly placed shot from someone who knew how to wait. As the unit moved deeper into the heart of the jungle, the laughter began to fade, replaced by a tense, heavy silence. The amateur from the backwoods was about to show them that a rifle's value isn't found in a catalog, but in the steady hands of the man who knows exactly what a single bullet is worth. The Solomon Islands were not just a battlefield, they were a green hell. As the battalion pushed deeper into the dense interior of Guadalcanal, the humid air became so thick it felt like breathing through a wet cloth. But it wasn't the heat or the malaria that chilled the men to the bone, it was the silence. It was a deceptive, heavy silence that was broken only by the sharp, terrifying crack of a Japanese arisaka. The Japanese snipers were masters of invisibility. They didn't just hide in the jungle, they became part of it. They used smokeless powder and long, thin barrels that hid their muzzle flashes. They tied themselves high into the crowns of coconut palms or dug spider holes beneath the roots of banyan trees, covered with lids of earth and grass. To the American soldiers, the enemy was a ghost that struck without warning. A medic would lean over a wounded man, only to be struck down himself. An officer would point toward a map, and a second later he would be slumped over in the mud. The terror in the jungle was psychological. The men began to jump at every snapping twig or rustling leaf. They sprayed the tree line with thousands of rounds from their M1 Garands and Browning machine guns, wasting ammunition on shadows and empty vines. But the snipers remained. The high-tech firepower of the United States Army was failing against a handful of men with ancient bolt-action rifles who knew how to wait. Arthur's unit was pinned down near a muddy creek. 2 men had already been hit, their screams echoing through the ferns, but no one could see where the shots were coming from. The trained marksmen of the company, equipped with the latest scopes, were sweating and trembling. They peered through the brush, their eyes crossing from the strain, seeing nothing but shades of green. In the corner of a foxhole, Arthur sat perfectly still. While the others panicked, he was back in the hills of the south, watching for the flick of a squirrel's tail or the slight shift in a deer's ear. He didn't look through his sights yet. Instead, he watched the birds. He noticed a group of parrots that refused to land in a specific mahogany tree. He noticed a patch of moss on a high branch that seemed a fraction too dark to be natural. The soldiers around him were still clutching their superior weapons, their knuckles white with fear. One of them looked over at Arthur, who was calmly adjusting the bolt on his worn, mail-order rifle, the same gun they had laughed at just days ago. The soldier was about to crack another joke, but the words died in his throat. He saw Arthur's eyes. They weren't the eyes of a terrified kid anymore. They were the cold, predatory eyes of a hunter who had finally spotted his prey. Arthur slowly raised the wooden stock to his shoulder. He didn't fire wildly into the green. He waited. He waited for the wind to shift a single leaf. He waited for the Japanese sniper to make the one mistake every hunter eventually makes. He waited for the enemy to breathe. The jungle held its breath with him. In that moment, the mockery ended. The terror remained, but for the first time since they entered the jungle, the Americans weren't just the hunted. They had brought a hunter of their own. The standoff at the creek had left the company paralyzed, but the arrival of a high-ranking colonel from division headquarters brought a different kind of tension. He was a man of the old army, a believer in regulation, standardization, and the absolute superiority of military-issued hardware. When he began his inspection of the foxholes, his eyes fell upon Arthur. Amidst the mud and the blood, Arthur sat cradling his worn civilian-grade bolt-action rifle as if it were a holy relic. The colonel stopped in his tracks, his face reddening with a mixture of disbelief and fury. "What is that piece of scrap doing on my front line, Private?" he barked, his voice cutting through the humid air. He pointed a gloved finger at the rifle's weathered stock and its non-standard iron sights. "This is the United States Army. We provide the finest M1 Garands in the world, and you're carrying a mail-order toy? Hand it over." Arthur stood up slowly, his movements deliberate. "It's not a toy, sir," he said quietly, his southern drawl thick but steady. "It's the gun I know. It's the gun that hits what I'm looking at." The surrounding officers, the elite, smirked. These were men who had been trained at Fort Benning, men who studied ballistics charts and believed that a weapon's effectiveness was determined by its serial number and the cost of its optics. To them, Arthur was a backwoods anomaly, a country boy who didn't understand that modern war was a science. The company commander tried to intervene, explaining that Arthur was the only one who had spotted anything in the trees, but the colonel wasn't interested in anecdotes. He saw a violation of protocol. "I don't care if it can hit a tin can in a backyard," the colonel snapped.
In the jungle, you need reliability, fire rate, and standard issue caliber. That junk is going to get you killed, and more importantly, it's going to get the men around you killed. Corporal, take the private's rifle and give him a real weapon." The air in the trench grew cold. The men who had spent the last 2 hours huddled in fear under the Japanese snipers looked at each other. They had mocked the rifle too, but they had also seen Arthur's calmness. Just as the corporal reached for the rifle, a single shot rang out from the jungle canopy. A leaf fluttered down, severed cleanly by a Japanese bullet that missed the colonel's head by mere inches. The elite scrambled for cover, diving into the mud, their polished boots splashing in the muck. The colonel hit the ground, his dignity vanishing in an instant. But Arthur didn't dive. He merely knelt, his body becoming a statue. Without a word, he raised the mail-order rifle. He didn't look at the colonel. He didn't look at the panicked officers. He looked at a single vibrating palm frond 300 yards away. "Sir," Arthur whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of the jungle, "I reckon I'll keep the toy for just a minute longer." He pulled the trigger. The sound was a sharp, dry snap, different from the heavy boom of the M1s. A split second later, a dark shape tumbled from the high canopy of a mahogany tree, crashing through the branches before hitting the jungle floor with a heavy thud. It was the sniper who had been terrorizing the unit for days. Arthur worked the bolt with a smooth, rhythmic flick, ejecting the spent casing and chambering a new round before looking back at the mud-covered colonel. The scorn was gone. The laughter had died. In the eyes of the elite, the junk rifle had just become the most valuable asset on the island.
After the fall of the first sniper, a strange atmosphere settled over the battalion. The colonel no longer demanded Arthur's rifle. Instead, he gave him a silent nod of permission. Arthur didn't wait for a formal order. He didn't take a radio, and he didn't take a spotting partner. He simply took a small bag of dried rations, a canteen of water, and his box of mail-order cartridges. He slipped into the emerald shadows of the tree line and vanished. What followed were the 4 days of silence, a period that would become legendary in the annals of Pacific warfare. While the rest of the company stayed in their defensive perimeter, paralyzed by the invisible threat, Arthur became a ghost. He understood that to kill a Japanese sniper, you had to think like one. He didn't walk through the jungle, he flowed. He would spend 6 hours moving only 50 yards, sliding on his belly through the rotting vegetation, ignoring the leeches and biting ants that covered his skin. He wasn't looking for men. He was looking for wrongness, a vine that didn't hang quite right, a bird that flew away too suddenly, or the faint metallic scent of gun oil cutting through the smell of damp earth. On the first day, he found 2. They were tied into the high branches of a banyan tree, camouflaged with palm fronds. Arthur sat motionless for 4 hours, waiting for the sun to move so the light wouldn't glint off his own barrel. When the moment was right, he fired twice. 2 bodies dangled from their safety ropes like macabre puppets. He didn't celebrate. He just moved on. By the 2nd and 3rd days, a psychological war had developed. The Japanese snipers realized there was a predator among them. They stopped firing at the American camp and began hunting the man who was hunting them. It became a deadly game of hide and seek in a cathedral of green. Arthur used the tricks he had learned hunting foxes in the Appalachian hills. He would prop up his helmet on a stick to draw fire, then wait for the tiny puff of smoke to reveal his enemy's position. He killed 3 more on the 2nd day, and 4 on the 3rd. Each time his mail-order rifle spoke with a single decisive snap. Back at the camp, the soldiers listened. They would hear a lone shot echo from deep in the jungle, followed by hours of oppressive quiet. They began to count. "That's 6, a sergeant would whisper.
"That's 9, another would reply. The silence was Arthur's greatest weapon. He was starving, his water was gone, and his eyes were bloodshot from the strain of staring through iron sights for 96 hours, but he refused to come in until the woods were clean. On the 4th day, he faced the final challenge. A Japanese officer, a master sniper who had remained hidden despite Arthur's best efforts. They stalked each other for half a day across a ravine. The Japanese sniper fired first, the bullet grazing Arthur's shoulder and tearing his shirt. Arthur didn't flinch. He stayed down, slowed his breathing, and waited for the enemy to believe he had won. When the Japanese sniper finally raised his head to confirm the kill, Arthur was already centered. The 11th shot was the loudest. When Arthur finally walked back into the American lines on the evening of the 4th day, he was a different man. He was skeletal, covered in mud and insect bites, and his hands were stained of the oil of his rifle. He didn't say a word. He walked to the colonel's tent, laid 11 Japanese rank insignias on the table, and went to find a place to sleep. The jungle was finally quiet. The boy from the backwoods had silenced it.
The silence that Arthur brought back from the jungle did not end when the battalion moved out. It grew into a reverence that followed him across every ridge and through every swamp of the Pacific campaign. The men who had once mocked his mail-order rifle now looked at it with a kind of superstitious awe. It was no longer a piece of junk, it was a talisman. When Arthur walked by, soldiers would step aside, their eyes fixed on the worn wooden stock that had silenced 11 of the Emperor's finest marksmen in a mere 96 hours. As the war ground toward its bloody conclusion, the legend of the rifle reached the ears of the brass at the very top. Ordnance officers and ballistics experts came to inspect the weapon, bringing with them their micrometers and gauges. They couldn't understand it. By all official military standards, the rifle was obsolete. Its action was slower than the Garand, its capacity was limited, and its finish was eroded by the tropical salt air. But when they asked Arthur to demonstrate it on the range, he would simply settle into his rhythmic backwoods crouch and put 10 bullets through a hole the size of a silver dollar. The experts left shaking their heads, forced to accept a truth the military rarely admits, that the ultimate weapon isn't made of steel and springs, but of muscle, memory, and a hunter's soul. When the surrender was finally signed and the world began to pivot back toward peace, the fate of the junk rifle took a turn that mirrored the humility of its owner. Most heroes of the war brought back trophies, Lugers, samurai swords, or polished bayonets. The colonel, now a staunch defender of Arthur's story, offered to have the rifle chrome-plated and mounted on a plaque of fine mahogany to be displayed at the Infantry Museum. He wanted it to be a symbol of American ingenuity and grit. But Arthur, true to the boy from the backwoods, politely declined. To him, the rifle wasn't a museum piece or a trophy of death. It was the tool that had saved his life and the lives of his friends. It was the bridge that connected the soldier in the mud to the boy in the hills. He didn't want it behind glass. He wanted it back in the woods, where the only things he had to hunt were squirrels for his mother's stew. Arthur returned to the South with the rifle tucked in a simple canvas bag. He went back to the same hills, the same humid air, and the same quiet life he had left behind. For decades, the rifle sat in a corner of his cabin or leaned against the porch railing after a day in the forest. His neighbors knew him as a quiet man who never missed a shot, but he rarely spoke of the 11 snipers or the 4 days of silence. The rifle eventually passed down to his son and then his grandson, its wood darkened by the oils of 3 generations of hands. The legend of the junk rifle lives on not in the halls of government, but in the stories told by the descendants of the men who survived that muddy creek in the Solomons. It stands as a reminder to every soldier and every skeptic that you should never judge a man by the shine of his gear. Sometimes the greatest power on the battlefield isn't the most expensive machine. It's the man who knows exactly what he can do with a mail-order rifle and a single steady breath.